Thank you all for joining me today. I'm Nicole Beniamini, Vice President of Edison Research, and one of the many brains behind the annual Infinite Dial study that we released with Triton Digital. Today's webinar will focus on people who really care about discovering music, using some never-before-seen data from our 2020 Infinite Dial report. Just a few notes before we start. Please use the hashtag Infinite Dial if you plan on sharing any data. Second, we won't have any time for a live Q&A today, but if you do have any questions, please enter them in the Zoom Q&A box, and my colleagues here at Edison will answer them. If you are watching the replay of this webinar, please reach out to us at info@edisonresearch.com with any questions. Before we look at Infinite Dial data, I want to set the stage by sharing a few important slides from another Edison survey, Share of Ear. If you aren't familiar with it, Share of Ear is our subscription-only product that asks respondents to keep a 24-hour diary of their audio listening habits, and it is the only single-source measure of all forms of audio in the U.S. Data from our latest Share of Ear report reveals that Americans listen to an average of 3 hours and 46 minutes of audio per day. Now, the great thing about Share of Ear is that we're able to take those 3 hours and 46 minutes of audio listening and determine that 77% of that daily audio time is spent listening to music. That calculates to an average of roughly 2 hours and 54 minutes a day with music, which is a lot of time. But as you can imagine, people have different reasons for listening to music. Some listen to relax, some listen to be reminded of the good old days, which I guess nowadays is considered 2019. And then some people listen to discover the latest songs. And that's the group we're going to look at today. But first, I want to take a moment to review the methodology behind the data. In January and February of 2020, before the COVID pandemic completely disrupted our lives, Edison Research and Triton Digital conducted a nationally representative telephone study of Americans aged 12 plus. These findings were released back in March during our annual webinar. Today's data, however, comes from the supplemental online study of over 3,000 respondents we conducted at the same time. Having an online component to Infinite Dial allowed us to ask the many questions that were unable to fit in our more time-sensitive phone survey. Just a note, all data was weighted to match the 12-plus U.S. population. So let's begin. The title of this webinar is New Music Seekers, but in order to look at them, we have to define who they are. We asked our online respondents how important it is for them to learn about and stay up to date with music. 24% of them said it was very important, 43% said it was somewhat important, and 33% said it was not important at all. So while 2/3 of Americans think it's important to stay up to date with music, today's webinar will focus on those who feel most strongly about it, the 24% who said it was very important to learn about and stay up to date with music. Despite so much of Americans' audio time listening to music, discovering new music is only very important to a small percentage of Americans, who we will refer to as new music seekers throughout the webinar. And as you'd expect, this level of importance is influenced by a person's age. Among the total 12 to 34-year-old U.S. population, 35% of them say it is very important to learn about and stay up to date with music, compared to 25% of those aged 35 to 54, and just 10% of those aged 55 and older. New music is often associated with young music, so it's not surprising to find an inverse relationship between the value of new music and a person's age. And since age plays such a critical role in how these new music seekers listen to and discover music, we'll show plenty of analysis by demos. Now, whereas the gender composition of new music seekers is roughly the same as the total U.S. population, the age composition looks different. Nearly half of new music seekers, 46%, are between the ages of 12 and 34. This means that a lot of what we'll see here today will be driven by these younger respondents. And to round out the demographics, here's the ethnic composition of our new music seekers. This group is slightly more Hispanic than the total U.S. population, which makes sense since according to the census data, Hispanics in the U.S. are younger than the general population. And as the previous slide told us, younger people are more likely to be new music seekers. So now that we've established who these new music seekers are, let's discover what they're consuming and how it might vary based on age. We'll start with social media. 77% of new music seekers say they currently use Facebook, despite the fact that nearly half of them are 12 to 34. However, it's this younger cohort who manages to push Instagram to a close second, with 74% of new music seekers saying they currently ever use the social network service. They are also likely responsible for allowing TikTok to debut this year at a pretty impressive number, with nearly 1/3 of new music seekers ever using it. And which social media service are new music seekers using most often? Once again, it's Facebook, taking 43% of the pie. 20% use Instagram most often, and 11% said Snapchat. But now we'll look and see why looking at the data by age is so important. As expected, Facebook's share as the social network site used most often grows with the age of the new music seeker. Just look at how it dominates among new music seekers age 55 and older. But Facebook does lose its clear lead among those 12 to 34, as it is essentially tied with Instagram. We should also note TikTok's appearance for the 12 to 34-year-olds. And while 5% might not seem high today, keep in mind that this study was conducted back in January and February, before the quarantine that likely boosted its user base, even among the older age groups. And remembering that TikTok is a result of an acquisition of the lip-sync video sharing app Musical.ly reminds us that TikTok will continue to evolve as a source of new music. But why does social media matter in a webinar about discovering new music? Well, according to our research, more than half of new music seekers, 53% of them, say they currently use social media to share updates on the music they're listening to with friends and family. Discovering and sharing music have always been important functions of social media. Think of all the artists who found their fame through MySpace. And we've already seen the same on TikTok, with hits such as Old Town Road and Dance Monkey. Now, there's another reason why this slide is so important. Sharing music updates and playlists through social media is especially critical nowadays because the physical way we used to share music is diminishing. When we asked our new music seekers just how much of their overall audio listening is done through earbuds or headphones, 30% said all of it. And when we add the two blue bars together, we see that 67%, 2/3 of new music seekers spend at least most of their time listening to audio through earbuds or headphones. This means that whatever music they're listening to, new or not, is usually done privately. And as we look at it by age, we see that this mostly private listening experience isn't only for the very young. Even the majority of new music seekers aged 35 to 54 listen to most of their music through earbuds or headphones. Like with so many other things we used to do in person, sharing the audio you're listening to has now become digital. So just what audio are these new music seekers listening to? Let's take a look. First, a quick snapshot of audio brand awareness. Among those who are very interested in keeping up to date with music, Spotify is number 1, with 82% of new music seekers saying they're aware of the service. It's followed very closely, however, by Pandora, with 81% awareness. While this order is a bit different from the one we shared in our Infinite Dial webinar in March, with Pandora having a significant lead in awareness above the other audio brands among the 12-plus population, it does make sense. Spotify has positioned itself to be the audio platform for not only discovering music, but for sharing it as well. Now, Spotify's number 1 spot is even more apparent when we look at monthly listening, with nearly half of all new music seekers, 49%, saying they've listened to Spotify in the last month. 36% said they listened to Pandora, and 31% said they listened to Google Play. But now let's see how this order changes by age. I'm going to start with the new music seekers who are 12 to 34 and just focus on their bars for a minute. Here we can see Spotify's lead jump even higher, with 58% of 12 to 34-year-old new music seekers saying they listened to it in the last month, followed by 34% who listened to Pandora. But when we pull out their data, we also see the importance of SoundCloud to this group of new music seekers. 31% of them said they listened to it in the last month. This puts them in a tie for third with Apple Music. Monthly listening to Spotify and Pandora balance out, however, when we look at new music seekers who are 35 to 54, with 44% of them listening to each service in the last month. 39% listened to Amazon Music, and 38% listened to Google Play. Lastly, we'll look at new music seekers who are 55 and older, and they show a different rank order. Here, Google Play is the most listened to audio brand, with 35% of this group saying they listened to it in the last month. iHeartRadio comes next at 30%, followed by a tie between Pandora and Amazon Music at 28%. Among the new music seekers who listened to Spotify in the last month, 45% are listening with a paid subscription, which shows the value many place on music. However, there are plenty of new music seekers who use ad-supported music services. 79% of the new music seekers who listened to Pandora in the last month use the ad-supported version of the service. Now here's what new music seekers listened to in the last week. It follows a similar trend to the monthly listening, with Spotify on top at 43%. 29% listened to Pandora in the last week, followed by Apple Music and Amazon Music, both with 26% of new music seekers saying they listened in the last week. When asked which audio brand they use most often, almost one-third of new music seekers said Spotify, 18% said Pandora, and 13% said Apple Music. Once again, we can see how Spotify's branding as a new music source is important among those who are interested in music discovery. But without that high need for music, Spotify's share drops, as we see here when we compare it to what we'll call the satisfied listeners, or the 33% who said that it was not at all important to stay up to date with music. While Pandora does serve as a source for new music, it's likely the customized stations and playlists that make it a favorite among this group, with 30% of satisfied listeners saying Pandora is the audio brand used most often. Now let's unpack this by age. So we're going back now to the new music seekers. The first thing you might see is red, as in the red bar representing the 38% of new music seekers age 55 and older who say they listen to iHeartRadio most often. It might seem surprising, but as we'll see in a bit, these older music seekers are still very much listening to AM/FM radio, where the name iHeart is often heard and talked about. This just goes to show the power of advertising. Now, among the younger demos, Spotify is the audio brand used most often among new music seekers 12 to 54. But it is worth noting that Apple Music scores higher among those 12 to 34, while Amazon Music does well among those 35 to 54. Now, we wouldn't be good researchers if we didn't mention YouTube listening in a webinar about new music seekers. When asked if they listened to YouTube specifically for music or music videos in the last week, 62% of new music seekers said yes. But when we look at this by age, you might be amazed to discover that weekly YouTube music listening is actually highest among new music seekers who are 35 to 54. We actually just released some data points that reveal a similar decrease of YouTube music listening among the total U.S. population, particularly among those under the age of 35. But even with this downward trend, weekly listening to YouTube for music among new music seekers is still higher than the audio brands we've already reviewed. Now, since so much of audio consumption is done in the car, we should also look at what these new music seekers are listening to when they're behind the wheel. Among the new music seekers who are age 18 and older and were in a car in the month prior to this pre-COVID study, 80% said they currently ever listen to AM/FM radio in their primary vehicle. Interestingly, 2/3 of them reported listening to owned digital music, which is higher than we were expecting. One theory behind this number is the fact that many subscription audio services, such as Spotify or Amazon Music, allow listeners to save songs and playlists to a personal music collection. So even though a person only owns the music for as long as they have a paid subscription, he or she might still consider those songs as their own. Now let's look at it by age. Here we see AM/FM radio is the most commonly used audio source in the car across all ages of new music seekers. It is, however, significantly higher among new music seekers who are age 35 and older, with 90% saying they ever listen to radio in the car. Looking at this by age also reveals just how much new music seekers listen to SiriusXM, with around 1/3 of new music seekers aged 12 to 54 saying they ever use satellite radio in the car. In fact, more than 1/3 of new music seekers say they have a subscription to SiriusXM, which is nearly double the percentage of the general population 12 plus. Many of these new music subscribers are maintaining paid subscriptions to both SiriusXM and a streaming music platform, which really highlights the value that these new music seekers place on getting access to new music. But with all these audio options in the car, which one do new music seekers use most often? 1/3 of new music seekers in this car base say AM/FM radio. 28% say it is their owned music, which includes both digital files as well as CDs, and 13% say online audio. But what if you don't care about discovering music? What is your main in-car audio source then? Well, given the fact that AM/FM radio also provides yesterday's favorites, as well as news, talk, and sports, it's not surprising that its in-car share nearly doubles to 64% among this group of satisfied listeners. Again, these are the people who say that it is not important at all to stay up to date with music. Now, AM/FM radio's share also changes when we look at it by the age of new music seekers. More than half of new music seekers age 55 plus say that it is the source that they use most often in the car. But we should also note that radio is still used by the younger new music seekers as well, with 29% of 18 to 34-year-olds saying it is their primary audio source in the car. Now that we've covered where these new music seekers are listening to audio, let's ask ourselves the question that I know you've all been waiting for. Where are they going to discover new music? The increasing ways for people to listen to music also means an increase in opportunities to discover music. We gave respondents a list of sources they might use to find out about music. And not surprisingly, YouTube tops the list, with 2/3 of new music seekers saying they currently ever use it for music discovery. Friends and family come in second, at 47%, and AM/FM radio is a close third, with 46% of new music seekers ever using it to find out about music. When we look at new music seekers who were 12 to 34, we see YouTube is still number one, but Spotify rises to second place, with 51% saying they use it to discover music. AM/FM radio, while lower among this group, should not be discounted, as it is a source of music discovery for 37% of new music seekers aged 12 to 34. Among new music seekers who are 35 to 54, we see YouTube is still on top, but now it's AM/FM radio that follows it, with 53% using it to discover music. Facebook rounds the top three sources at 45%. And not surprisingly, we see AM/FM radio jump to first place among new music seekers who are age 55 and older, with 70% of this age group saying they use it to discover music. YouTube comes in second with 57%, and friends and family are third at 53%. One thing to note after looking at these slides is just how consistently high YouTube is across all three age groups. Despite whatever decline YouTube might be experiencing, it is still a music discovery source that does not discriminate by age. Another thing to observe is the percent of new music seekers who are using video games as a source of new music. Nearly 1/4 of the new music seekers who were aged 12 to 34 say they use video games as a way to learn about music. You don't even have to play video games to discover the music in them. Over half of new music seekers say they ever watch other people play live-streamed video games on services such as Twitch or YouTube Gaming. New music can be discovered through the playlists in these games themselves, such as the lengthy playlist in NBA 2K, or from actually watching concerts in the games themselves, such as Travis Scott's recent Fortnite concert. And those behaviors aren't just confined to 12 to 34-year-olds. In fact, the percentage of 35 to 54-year-olds who have watched live-streamed video games is even higher. And not all of these stream viewers even play the games themselves. Finally, though at 27% this behavior is less prevalent, that's still more than 1/4 of older new music seekers who are logging into Twitch watching other people play Call of Duty. When we asked new music seekers which source they use most often to discover music, YouTube wins again with 26%. 19% said Spotify, and 11% said AM/FM radio. But to once again give this data some context, let's compare the new music seekers with the satisfied listeners. Among those who aren't actively pursuing new music, 35% say that AM/FM radio is where they end up hearing it. YouTube and friends and family are tied for second, each receiving 17% of the share among satisfied listeners. But now let's look at this chart among new music seekers again, this time by age. YouTube ranks high across all age groups, and Spotify and AM/FM radio continue their battle of the ages. Spotify is higher among the younger new music seekers, and AM/FM radio is higher among the older ones. But let's focus on the middle age group, the new music seekers who are 35 to 54. This group, figuratively and literally, is caught in the middle. On one hand, these new music seekers grew up in a radio-dominant world where AM/FM radio was the source for hearing new music. Yet 14% of them say AM/FM radio is their main source for music discovery, compared to the 19% who say either Spotify or Pandora. So while AM/FM radio is still a solid platform for these 35 to 54-year-old new music seekers, there's a definite shift towards new audio platforms happening, similar to the one we reported in a 2019 study that found parents are learning and using the technology of their kids, particularly of their teens. So what can we take away from today's data? Well, first understand that while many people are interested in listening to music, only 24% of Americans are interested in staying up to date with music. And that percent decreases as a person ages. Not every format or platform needs to incorporate a ton of the latest songs. Most people are happy hearing their favorites. But for those who are interested in learning about music, keep in mind that more than half of them are age 35 and older. Make sure you consider them as well, especially since many of them have children who might influence which audio platforms they use. New music seekers are valuable in promoting what they hear, and in today's world, a lot of that promotion is done through social media and shared playlists. The physical sharing of music, such as through boomboxes or workplace speakers, has greatly diminished with the prevalence of headphones and earbuds, especially among the younger new music seekers. The number of ways people can learn about new music is swelling, from social media apps to video games, and it's the young new music seekers who are more likely to try these new sources. And lastly, online audio platforms such as YouTube and Spotify are increasingly becoming the main source of new music for those who really value it, even among those who grew up with AM/FM radio. Well, that's all I have for today. I hope the data provided you with valuable insight on music discovery and those who seek it. These slides, as well as a recording of the presentation, will be available on the Edison Research website shortly after the webinar. But please join us again in 2 weeks on July 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern as my colleague Megan Vartan shares data surrounding the listening habits of Gen Z. Details and registration for the webinar will be posted soon. You won't want to miss it. Thanks and have a great day.